Hi, everybody, and welcome to Nomadic Diaries today. It's my privilege to welcome Tanya Crossman, who is the Director of Research and International Education at TCK Training, a leading global provider of preventative care for TCKs. And we're going to talk about that in this episode. She is also the author of Misunderstood: The Impact of Growing Up Overseas in the 21st Century, and the co-author of the most recent book, Thongs or Flip-Flops: Australian Kids Overseas and What Comes Next. Is that the title?
That is the title.
Thanks for joining us today, Tanya. I am so excited to see you and speak to you. Tell us a little bit about your experience with TCK-ness.
TCKness. So, well, let me give you my background. I grew up with a father who worked for a multinational company, and that meant that we moved. We moved within Australia, which is my passport country, and we moved between Australia and the US. So my first flight was as a 15-month-old from Sydney to North Carolina. I mean, there were a couple stops because back in those days you couldn't fly that far direct, but
Sure.
I started speaking over there. I had a few words, but I mean, that's where I was doing a lot of my talking. We had a few months over there. Um, Came back and went there again, had another move in Australia, and then went to the States again, where I did a couple years of high school at a local school in the US. At one point, I have two sisters, and at one point, we had one in elementary school, one in middle school, and me in high school all at the
Oh
same time.
my.
Then we came back to Australia, which was surprisingly the most difficult move of the lot. Surprising to me at the time. Now, with all the knowledge I have now, very unsurprising, but really struggled with that one. Then, when I was 21, I went to China, where I was doing the last year of my degree. I was majoring in Mandarin Chinese, and I was studying at a Chinese university. Went for 1 year, stayed for close to 13, because,
And you,
those of us in that world, we kind of know
yes,
that sometimes that's what happens. But
yes.
a big part of the reason I stayed was after about 18 months, I started working with this sort of youth group for kids who were growing up in China but were not Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
They had passports from all over the world, as I started into event planning for these sort of camps and retreats for these kids, have this pile of passports with like 70 countries in there.
Oh my.
Um, and they came from all kinds of backgrounds all over the world, diplomat kids, military kids, kids like me whose parents worked for multinationals, kids whose parents were entrepreneurs running their own businesses overseas, some whose parents were teachers at universities or local schools or international schools, some whose parents were missionaries. Like, there was a big diversity. And I just felt so at home there. And it took 2 years of doing that to realize it's because we're all third culture kids, or
Yes.
TCKs. And that sort of started me on a new career trajectory I never saw coming, where I've been working in this field for 20 years now, and this is what I do.
Wow. 20 years in this
Well,
field.
it's going to be 20 years in about 6 months, yeah.
Congratulations. And it's
Yeah.
such a new and cutting edge field.
The number of times I go and do talks doing PD for educators in international schools to
Yeah.
teach them about their students' experiences, and there's teachers going, "Oh, wait a minute. Oh, this is also me." And they have this like mini existential
Yeah.
crisis at the moment. It's
Yes.
so common because so many people like me had this experience of growing up overseas, not knowing there was terminology, not knowing there was research, not knowing there was language to explain what we were having, what we were going through, and thinking there's something wrong with me. Every time we struggled with something, we thought it's a me
Mhm.
problem, not a common thing that lots of people experience.
Wow. And it is so ubiquitous, isn't it? It is
Hmm.
so heartfelt when you meet someone else in the situation. There's that obvious human connection, isn't there?
Yeah, that feeling of I'm not alone has
Mm.
become a mantra for so much of the work that I do. And for mine, I'm not alone moment was the first time I picked up a book that talked about this and went, oh, wait a minute. It was talking about repatriation, right? Talking about going back to your passport country.
Oh,
And I'm
really?
looking at this list of things. I mean, obviously, it was the TCK Bible,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
Growing Up Among Worlds.
Yeah.
And I was reading through the list of it had like a, this it was like a checklist of like things that
Yep.
you could commonly experience during repatriation as a
Mm.
TCK. And I'm going, check, 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 check. Oh my gosh, that's what happened to me. Because
Yeah.
when I moved back to Australia as a 15, nearly 16-year-old, I didn't have language to say that what I was going through was normal. And so 10 years later, I'm going, oh, so what I experienced that I didn't talk to anyone about because I thought I just wasn't coping and there was something wrong with me was actually
Mm.
really normal. It was like taking a weight off I didn't realize I'd been carrying. One of the greatest joys of my career is helping other people have those moments. Getting emails from people or social media messages from people who've read my books and have had that moment where they're like, oh, other people say the same thing. Other people feel the same way. It's not just me.
I think it's just such a wonderful door that you've opened and gone through and are ushering so many other people into it. I just think it's fabulous. Now, you mentioned the book, the TCK Bible, and that was written by Ruth Van Rieken, who one day we look forward to interviewing also on Nomadic Diaries. But tell me about your book, Misunderstood. This was your
Mm-hmm.
first
Yep.
major work where you interviewed so many TCKs. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, so misunderstood, a title I fought for, by the way, because it was a word that came up in all of those interviews. After
Uh,
about 50 interviews, I started specifically asking about the feeling of misunderstood, and stories and tears started flowing because it was such a common experience. So I'm like, this has to be the title. Misunderstood was designed to be a very different book to the TCK Bible, to Growing Up Among
mm,
Worlds, because
mm,
I'm like, that book already exists. We don't need to redo it. What can
mm,
I do that's going to add to the literature and add to what's already out there? And for me, what I wanted to do was a big part of what I do is advocate, right? Is
mm.
to so many third culture kids, we find it hard to tell other people what our experiences are because we don't know anything else. This is our normal. How
Yes.
can I tell you what it's like to grow up as a third culture kid if I haven't experienced anything else? And I
Mm,
found myself sitting in this in between space because I did have a good chunk of my childhood in Australia, enough to have an identity as Australian, but also had these experiences of leaving and coming back.
mm,
And then again, leaving as a 21-year-old and not coming back. And so did a lot of my maturing as an adult in a different culture. And as I talked to so many third culture kids over the years, working with these group of kids, was hearing all these common stories. I'm like, your parents aren't hearing what you're saying because they don't know to ask those questions and they don't, there's this disconnect, this misunderstanding happening. And I want to bridge that gap in a way that is honoring your voices and rather than me teaching about you. And so I made a book that was very much their stories all the way through. It's full of quotes directly from interviews with, the ages and the backgrounds of the TCKs themselves. So what country or countries their passport is from, and they've lived in, what background they have, as in, are they a military kid, a diplomat kid, a missionary kid,
yes.
corporate
Yeah.
kid like me? What kind of school did they go to? Did they go to a
Yeah.
boarding school or an international school, a local school like I did? Just to give you a sense that so often you can have two TCKs saying the exact same thing when they have completely different backgrounds. A big part of this was to be like, what would TCKs tell you if they could,
And
right?
what is it that they have in common? What are the silos? What are the
Mm-hmm.
big rocks that are in
Yeah.
common for them? Because obviously they have
Yeah.
different personalities, different
Yes.
parenting, different backgrounds, and we
Yeah.
are all unique and
Yeah.
individuals. I often say that, each of us is an unrepeatable miracle.
I like that.
And as
Well,
un
yeah.
as unrepeatable miracles as we are, but you were looking for the silos. You were looking for where are the threads? What can I draw out of this? I've
The
read the
thread
have the book.
is a word I specifically used because it's like, what are the common threads that
Yes,
TCKs have?
yes.
Because a TCK is not a personality trait. Everyone is unique and different and individual. One of the things I said in the introduction is this is like a window into their experiences, right? This is a
Yeah.
way to understand how to understand someone. What questions
Exactly.
can you ask? How can you think about their
Yes.
experiences?
Yeah.
Because the third culture kid experience, it's not about the personality traits we have. It's
Mm,
about the shared experiences that we have and how we react to those. And there are some common ways to react to those shared experiences. And so I'm not saying all TCKs are this way. I go, TCKs have this experience. Here are three common ways that we react to that experience. And
yes.
that's what's going to look like shared
Yeah.
traits is just
Yeah.
these coping strategies we develop. And those coping strategies can be positive, they can be negative, they can be neutral. But what often happens is we develop these coping strategies as children, as teenagers, and then at a certain point in adulthood, those coping strategies don't work anymore. And it's one of the biggest reasons I'm driven to work with third culture kids is if we can help the people caring for them understand this process and understand these coping strategies, we can support them with preventive care. That means they
Mm,
don't crash as adults with coping strategies that don't
yeah.
work.
Yes. And especially in this day and age when there are so many different kinds of expats and so many
Mm,
different kinds of ways and lifestyles, I find myself looking at all, talking to different lifestyles because there's obviously diplomats, missionaries, and corporate, which is the big one. And then there's all the different kinds of nomads. You know, there are nomads who are
yes.
completely independent. There are
It's the
some who,
world schoolers and the
yes.
independent travel and
Yes,
yeah.
all of that. And so there are many, many children who, and many, and even more adults who I think just have no concept that there are markers and there are
Mm,
experiences in common. It wasn't until my husband and I sat down and we talked a lot when on that one night after we got a presentation at the school in Saudi Arabia by a woman who is a friend of mine. I had no idea. And she had grown up in Saudi, left, went to university, and became a teacher and came back like 20 years later and raised three kids there who,
mm,
so she's like a third generation in that compound. And
yeah.
so, or she or her kids are. So it's really important work. And I am so happy to see you doing this.
I still remember the very first fan letter I ever got. It was 1 month after Misunderstood launched. So this person had got the book very quickly and devoured it. It
Oh,
was a 16-year-old saying, you know, they lived in Central Asia. They'd been through an evacuation when they were 8 from a different Central Asian country. And they said, this is the first time I felt understood in 8 years.
my goodness.
And I
Yeah.
remember sitting on a park bench reading these words again and thinking, okay, I'm done. Like, if this is
Mm,
the only response I ever get from this book, it was worth it. And then
yeah.
it just kept going, right?
Yeah.
That there were so many people who needed someone to put their thoughts into words because they couldn't. Because the
Yes.
people who were able to put the thoughts into words, they were 20 years past being in this, 30 years past being
Mm,
in this, going through
yes.
therapy and working it
Yeah.
out. And the
Yes.
whole point of this was to go, other people have been there, you're not alone.
Yes.
And then therefore their parents and their educators and their other caregivers, extended family can read this and go, okay, so this might be how they're thinking. And here's how I can care for them.
Mm,
What's also fascinating to me is how many TCKs think that my experience is what all TCKs experience, or my experience is completely different and no TCKs have experiences like
and
mine.
so we go from one extreme to the other,
Yeah.
right?
And it's usually one or the other. And so
Yes.
when they read when TCKs themselves read these sections that talk about, okay, all these different sectors, what it's like to be a military kid, to be a missionary kid, to be a
Yes.
diplomat kid, to be an educator's child, what it's like to be someone who moves from country to country, what it's like to be someone who lives in one country their whole life, what it's
Yes.
like to move overseas the first time in your late teens, what it's like to grow up with a single parent overseas or a blended family overseas, all these different kinds of experiences. and they go, oh, wow, there's all these experiences I didn't know about. Or they go, oh, wow, there are lots of other people just like me. Maybe I didn't meet them in my childhood, but they're out there and they
Yeah,
feel the way I feel. And so, no matter what part of that spectrum they're on, that the TCKs themselves get to learn as well, because there is no one TCK way to live. There's so many experiences.
sure.
And so, there's lots for TCKs themselves to learn about each other.
And so when there is that recognition factor, and when there is
Mm.
that sort of download of the information and the identifying with it, um, what does that mostly express itself as? What does that look like on the outside to you as a researcher?
Mm. Good question. So, when someone has that light bulb moment of, oh my gosh, this is me, there's a couple different ways it can go. For some people, it's that sense of everything clicks into place and makes sense, right? Like, oh,
Yes.
this is why. So, I mean, I've had that moment of like, oh, this is why I feel so comfortable helping with this youth group because they're like me.
Yes.
There's oh, and that's why this was hard, or this is why, like, things start to make sense. For some people, there's a lot of difficult emotions that come up because they'd suppressed a lot of hard emotions.
Mm.
There's some people feel a pressure to say that everything about my childhood was wonderful. No one's
Oh,
childhood was 100% wonderful. Life is a mixture of hard things and good things, no matter how you grow up. And so I think for some people, that moment of recognition that there's a specific name for this type of childhood opens this floodgates of all this suppressed emotion, and it looks really messy for some people because it's
mm,
the trigger for them to process a lot of things that they
yeah.
had denied was there.
Yes. Yes.
So for some people, it's like this euphoria, and for other people, it's like, oh, we're going to go into some hard stuff now.
And so, what are the misconceptions about TCKs? And in your experience, are there misconceptions?
Oh, absolutely. I think the biggest one is about the name. So TCK, third culture kid. A lot of
Mm,
people assume third culture kid means the country my parents are from, my passport's from, the country I'm living in, smush it together, that's my third culture.
mm,
And so I get a lot of questions about, well, are my kids fourth culture kids or fifth culture kids? Because we've lived in all these other places or we have all these other cultural influences. But a third culture kid, we're not talking about three countries or three cultures, we're talking about three types of cultures. The first type of culture is the legal culture. This is any country that acknowledges me as belonging to them. Citizenship, I have a passport, I have permanent residency, not a visa, not a work visa, but like green
sure.
card level permanent residency.
Right.
In various studies I've done, about one third of TCKs have more than one legal culture. So they're
Wow.
either dual citizens or they're a citizen in one country and have permanent residency in another. In a study I just completed with TCK training, 14% were dual nationals. Second type of culture is the geographic culture. And this is anywhere that I have personal experience and interaction with the culture. So typically the countries I lived in. But I also include heritage culture here. So if my parent has immigrated from a country that I
Mm,
have never had citizenship in, I've never lived in, but that culture is very much alive in my experience through my parent, then I would count that as a geographic culture because I've had personal connection and interaction with that culture.
sure.
40% of TCKs have four or more geographic cultures,
Wow.
and 10% have six or more.
Wow.
So we are not talking about three cultures. For the majority of TCKs, we're well past three.
That is a lot of lived life experience for a young
Yes,
person to process.
exactly.
And I know I went to Cameroon. That was my first international experience. And I was 22, not prepared for it. My cerebellum was still not completely formed, I think.
Yep, me in China at 21.
And so we sort of grew up overseas, and that's a lot for people to process. So what do you tell parents about finding support and finding experts or people who can tease this out and who are secure enough to manage the conversations that are necessary. Because in my experience, not every single therapist or coach can
Oh,
handle it.
that's so true. Yeah. Well, part of it is that TCKs themselves have the same strengths, but also the same deficits a lot of the time.
Mm,
I mean, this is where the third culture itself comes into, right? That's the culture of the shared experiences. Like they've had
yes.
similar experiences, which can be great, and they feel really at home with each other, but they also have the same weaknesses. What we often find is that TCKs are intellectually ahead. A lot of them are going to high achieving schools, and a lot of them have high achieving parents.
Yes.
95% of TCKs will at least start university.
Mm,
80% have at least one parent with an advanced degree. And so there is this assumption, obviously, they're on a university track. I think if you took any subset of the population that have parents with advanced degrees, yep, you're going to see the vast majority of them are going to go to university. But also the international schools really funnel them that way. There is no sort of
sure.
looking
Oh,
at any other
definitely.
option. So you get
Yeah.
kids who are, they really plug into their intellectual side, the academic side.
Mm,
When I go to international school graduations, one third of the kids have got the cord showing that they are a 4.0 GPA, like
yeah, yeah,
straight A
yeah.
students. This is
Yes.
not normal, but it is in the international world, right? That's their normal. What they lose in the counterbalance is often the emotional intelligence.
Ah,
They often are behind on the emotional stuff, not because there's anything wrong with them at all, but
mm.
because they go through so many grief experiences, it gets overwhelming.
Wow. So grief actually suppresses the EQ, the emotional
Well, what
intelligence.
happens is when you have too much emotion to manage, you
Mm,
suppress the grief.
mm,
But when you don't do that processing, you aren't developing the skills.
mm.
And because they've just suppressed all the hard stuff, they don't do
Excellent.
the skill building that goes with it. Often, also, TCKs don't develop their conflict resolution skills because if I have a problem with my friend, that problem disappears when one of us leaves. Some of the emotional skills they need are coping skills to get through life because you can't just be sad all the time because you have to get up and get dressed and go to school and do your schoolwork and do your homework and do your chores and try to get a bit of sleep before you do it all again. You don't have time to sit and
Yeah.
process your emotions all day, every day when your friends are leaving yet again. And suppressing that emotion is a coping skill that allows them to get through. But at some point, they're going to have to go through all of that. And
Mm,
so, what parents can do, I talk about preventive care because what we can do is if we can be the ones who are modeling, expressing, and acknowledging and working through our emotions and helping
mm.
them do that, we are taking down the burden of what they're going to have to deal with later because it's
Oh,
not going to happen naturally for the
yeah,
TCK. It's something
yeah,
we have to make happen. We have to create space
yeah.
for and lead them through.
Well, this has been a wonderful opening conversation because I know that we're going to have more on this subject, Tanya, with you as an expert. Um, i- what one thing would you like to leave our listeners with today on this little encapsulated conversation we've had about who TCKs are, their natures, their natural impulses, and the support that we can give them?
Parenting is not easy anywhere, right? The
Right.
difficulty in parenting TCKs is that you're parenting children who are growing up in a completely different world than you are, and you might not
Yes.
realize it. You're moving to the same countries, but they're experiencing that differently than you are.
Mm,
And there is so much. The resources now from 10 or 15 years ago is just incredible. There is so much out there that can help you with family curricula, with books you can read, podcasts you can listen to help you understand your kids better. I keep a huge list on my personal website of just here's resources to help you with parenting with kids of different ages, with
mm,
multilingual parenting, because
mm.
I'm just amazed. There's so much there. And
Yes, yes.
yeah, just read something. You don't have
And
to know
so,
everything and do everything. Just pick up something that's going to help you learn your kid
mm.
better and have some strategies for your family.
And so if people want to reach out to you, Please tell us where we'll put all of the list, all of the links in the show notes, etc. But for now, where can you tell our listeners that they can find you first?
TanyaCrossman.com is me personally. It's where all my recommended resources are. TCKtraining.com, that's the company I'm a director at, which has all of our resources, and you can also catch me there.
Wonderful. Well, this has been just a lovely conversation. So great to see you again, and
You
I look
too.
forward to the next one. And listeners, I'd just like to add, we're going to say cheerio, masalama, hasta la vista.